So at the moment, I'm really interested in how emotions affect reasoning. So historically, people always thought of emotions as disruptive things, and people would say, stop being so emotional, like think rationally. And one of the things that people have found is people with certain damage to certain parts of the brain to do with emotion, once that's been damaged, they make really poor choices. So it seems like emotions must play some positive role. I mean, especially if emotions evolved. Suppose they're adaptations. I'm not saying they are, but perhaps they are, then they must do some positive work. Then the question is how to articulate what the actual positive thing is. And there's a lot of scientific data, and especially in psychology and neuroscience, to suggest that it does something, but then it's not still clear what that thing is. So I'm interested in what that exact thing is.
Understanding it.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
how far are we from really understanding how emotions play a role?
I think we're on the right track. I mean, sometimes, you make progress and then the psychological experiments turn out to be dubious, or there'll be new data that undermines the earlier data. But one of the really cool things I think that emotions do is it focuses your attention. So in a way, one of the things that people say is you're trying to make a choice. So you're trying to choose something. And there might be like hundreds and hundreds of options about what to do. And then the idea is emotions will help you fixate on a few bunch of options, so it narrows down the search space. So it's almost like emotions act like a torchlight, and it kind of shines on a set of things, and then it doesn't tell you what to do, but it says consider these options and avoid these other options. Do you want me to give you an example?
Yes, give me an example. That was very complex.
Sorry, no. The idea might be something like you're figuring out what to do tonight, and someone invites you to this bar, and you've had really bad emotional experiences when you've been to that bar before. Maybe the bartender's really rude to you, or your ex always is there at the bar. So when you think about going to that particular bar, you feel bad. And because of that, you're going to avoid going to that bar. So you've already ruled out one option because of an emotional response that you're having. And you can imagine the same kind of thing with the positive case, where there's some options which you might be neutral about, but some which you might think, I've had really good experiences in the past there. You've been happy, or kind of, you felt joy, or maybe you don't really...
Doesn't that play a massive role in sort of like racism and bias in general?
No, exactly, because I'm really interested in and that's the new thing that I haven't really written about, but there's these biases, and what's interesting is emotions might be relevant, but they can be learned, these biases. So how do you account for these responses which are really quick like that, but you acquire them over time? And so the example, so I really started working on this or thinking about this when I lived in the US, and this was around that time when all the shootings were happening of Black American men, especially, or young men too. And I mean, it's been happening for a long time, but now there's documentation, right, with
actual like footages.
So what's happening, and a lot of things might be happening, but some of it might be that some of these cops are going into black neighborhoods and they're not familiar with that, and there's all these negative stereotypes of blacks in America. So you're already heightened, you're emotionally aroused, and that makes you like react in a different way to how you would have reacted if you're going in a more emotionally stable way. So it seems like emotions, especially fear and anxiety, are probably playing some role. But the interesting thing is that racial bias towards black people, that's a learned thing. It's not, you're not born with like a bias towards...
And it plays the opposite way as well, like the bias of policemen and policewomen in, especially if they're white and they're in black neighborhoods.
That's
like
what
that bias is real strong as well.
Sure.
And it's interesting we're talking about this because, I've been closely like just thinking about it and observing that we make so many general sort of things, like saying this person because he looks this way is this type. From a very scientific point of view, it's like when your data set is so small and when you make a conclusive argument as this is that, it's irrational. It doesn't make sense. But yet we do it on a consistent basis, And I want to understand why, though. Is it because we want to shorten the decision-making process and categorize things?
I think definitely. I think our brains are probably designed to use heuristics, right?
Yeah.
So these biases can be negative or positive, but you're using shortcuts. So what happens is, as you said, it's a small sample, and then you're generalizing, and that's how it works. But then when you generalize using a small sample, you're going to always run into exceptions to the rule, and that's when the biases aren't playing a positive role. You're going to be wrong when you're faced with a bigger sample
size. Well, it's confirmation bias as well. Once you've made that decision, this person is, then you could disregard all his other actions, but when it aligns with your view of this person, you're like, like, this is what it is.
Sure.
Which is very interesting. It doesn't really make sense, and it's not really smart to do so, but yet we always do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's natural, but I think there's definitely a tendency to do it. And it's not just with an individual, right? You might do it with a group of people of a different race, or you might do it across gender lines. So you might say, women are like this, and then, you have this bias and you only pick out confirmations of that bias and ignore the other contradicting
that is fascinating.
data. Well, it's troubling as well, but it's really interesting in a way. And it seems like it's that thing. I think our brains... I'm not saying you can't override it. I think you can override it. But, I think the brain isn't designed to do more work than it has to. So it's always looking for easier ways to
But this has massive
things.
Implications to the person that's, giving you your job, or looking through your CV, to the person, who's going to serve you at a McDonald's. It has massive implications. And I think no one's really talking about it at that depth of how to consciously... think about the generalizations we're making on a daily, consistent basis, which is shocking. And, the implications are very vast, I would say.
Yeah, and I think people are kind of a little bit clued onto this now with the implicit bias cases. And I know that in like cafes and stuff...
Does that have any... Well, I heard some a podcast talking about the illegitimacy of the implicit bias tests and the implicit bias training to get it out of your system. Can that...
I'm not really sure. I mean, I know that I was going to say like places like Starbucks, which they've had controversy, and they run these workshops for the staff.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the success rate is like. And I mean, in a way, it's implicit, right? So you can't know that you have this bias, and you can try and account for it. And I'm sure it's not foolproof. But what I find interesting about the implicit bias, because there's a lot of traction now with this. But I think implicit bias is a broad umbrella term that's probably capturing a lot of different kinds of phenomena. And I think for me, I'm also interested in the role emotions might play in explaining some of the implicit bias cases. And I'm not saying every single instance of implicit bias emotions are involved in those cases, but I bet some probably are. So then how do you understand implicit bias in this broad sense, but tie that into how emotions might be biasing you in certain ways as well? But I'd be really curious to see if there are trainings, like ways to actually overcome it.
Yeah, I did hear them. I did hear, especially in America, they're running those workshops on how to get people to be not racist when they've failed the racist test, the implicit bias test.
Right.
And the way I think they tested if you were racist implicitly was they would flash, like objects.
Sure.
And they'd flash like a weapon, and then they'd flash like different genders or different races.
Yeah.
And they'd measure your heightened sense of emotional response.
Sure.
And was it correlating with the weapon and the race? And if it matched, then conclusively it meant you were implicitly biased negatively.
Yeah.
And then if it was a white person and a positive thing, then you were, stuff like that. Which is, I don't know, like, it's a complex thing, which is hard to say if that works.
I mean, what's interesting to me, again, I think with these cases, though, is these things are automatic now, right? And that's what they're measuring with these experiments, because there's almost like no actual high-level conscious activity going on. It's too soon. But these are still things which are acquired. So how do these learned things over time get to become automatic? And that's the interesting question, I think. So I think people used to have this false dichotomy where if it's quick, then it must be innate. And if it's slow, then it's something that can be learned. But I think what these experiments show is that these kinds of biases can be very quick and they kind of can be implicit, but they can also rest on certain kinds of cultural ideas. So like if you live in a culture where you think, black people are lazy or black people are dangerous, then you're more likely to have these kinds of biases, and they kind of feed into your brain, and at some point it becomes automatic. But it's a bit like, it's not the same thing, but like if you play sport or music, something is, to start with, it takes a while to learn it, but once you learn it, it becomes automatic. But it's once it's automatic, it's really quick, but it doesn't mean you were born with that ability. Yeah. It's something that you train. So I think these kinds of things, it's a product of like a kind of a diseased society in a way, that kind of. And what's interesting is these biases don't generalize across cultures. And the experiments I know, the biases, they, even people within the black community still have the implicit bias against other black people because it comes from the culture as a whole. So so I know that they've done, I don't know if you've heard about the shooter trials. No. So it's not an actual shooting, right? It's simulated, and you're told to shoot at someone holding a weapon, but don't shoot someone who's not holding a weapon. And you get people of different kinds of skin colors and ethnic backgrounds who are the people that you see. And most people are more likely to shoot at a black person who's not holding a weapon than someone who is white or Asian. And what they found was, in terms of the test subjects, even both Asians and blacks and whites, all of them are more likely to shoot at black people than white people. So it's not that simply by virtue of you being black yourself, you're kind of immune from these biases. So it's kind of really complicated.
Well, are we still considered racist if it's implicit compared to being consciously racist? Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
When do we define, when is the line cross in defining someone as racist, and when is it, they're just implicitly biased towards?
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think they're both troubling, but maybe the kind of the culpability goes away a little bit with the implicit case. So I mean, if you're an overt racist, then you kind of know that what you're doing is kind of in a way bad, or you kind of hold this stereotypical view that you're consciously aware that you do. So I think you're much more culpable than maybe having it ingrained in you somewhere that you're not aware of. Because I think what's interesting about those implicit bias cases are even like super liberal, open-minded people kind of have these biases. So maybe you're not as culpable, but you should still be trying to like override them or correct for them somehow.
That's very hard to consciously control something that's implicit.
Sure.
It's so frustrating. Like, I don't, like consciously you don't consider yourself as that, but when you unconsciously start thinking like that, it's like, am I really that? And you start to question, like,
you don't. Maybe it's really hard to pick yourself up on it. And what you could do is maybe create various kinds of behaviors. So like for me, like. So I grade students all the time, and I don't know what kind of implicit biases I have, and maybe I'm more likely to grade certain kinds of names better than other kinds of names, and a way to correct for it is just to not look at
the names.
Yeah, so that's a very...
What about style of writing, handwriting? Could that be another...
So luckily if my students submit it, like... they submit electronic copies, because the really worst thing as an academic is like sometimes you have no idea what they're writing because the handwriting is so poor, and my handwriting is so poor too. But so you spend a lot of time trying to decipher like this foreign script.